Russia still worships the hard man, the soldier, the coal miner, the factory foreman, strong, silent, dependable. The man who holds the country together with his bare hands. That's the image. The reality is far stranger. Because if you look at Russia today, more and more of those so-called traditional men are simply gone. Some were sent to the front and didn't come back. Some came back broken. Some got out while they could, and many were never replaced. So here's the real question. If this self-proclaimed macho empire is running short of men, who is actually keeping it afloat right now? Russia still talks like a male state, but increasingly it's being held together by the very people the regime has always treated as secondary, temporary, or expendable. My name is Elvira Berry. I'm a writer born in the Soviet Union. And today I want to show you what happens when an empire built on the myth of male power starts running out of male bodies and has to improvise just to keep the lights on. Here's what we're going to cover. How Russia burned through the human reserve it always took for granted. Why the state suddenly needs women in jobs it spent decades declaring off-limits. How labor shortages are turning retirement into yet another resource to be extracted. How nationalism keeps colliding with the desperate need for migrant workers. What it means when an authoritarian state starts recruiting labor from North Korea of all places. And finally, why Russia can't innovate its way out of a workforce crisis that it spent decades building. If you find this kind of analysis valuable, subscribe, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. You can also join my think tank, support me through PayPal or Super Thanks, or use height points. And if you're listening on Spotify, hit follow so the next episode lands in your feed automatically. Let's start with the myth. For centuries, Russia compensated for weak institutions with sheer numbers. Its economy lagged, its technology fell behind, but it had one reliable advantage: an enormous supply of compliant men it could throw at armies, mines, forests, construction sites, and state projects. Enough men to keep the machine running despite the losses. That human reserve had bailed Russia out over and over again, letting it punch above its weight against richer, more sophisticated rivals. That reserve is now running dry. And this didn't start with Putin's war. 2 world wars and decades of Stalinist terror wiped out entire generations. Total losses are hard to calculate with precision, but they run well into the tens of millions. After World War II, Russia's birth rate fell sharply. By the mid-1960s, it had settled near 2.0, a second demographic transition that arrived earlier than it did in the United States or France. The large, rural family with 5 children gave way to the urban family with 1 or 2. Then, after the Soviet collapse, another blow landed. In the 1990s, annual births were cut nearly in half, falling from around 2.5 million to roughly 1.2 million children per year. That generation is now in their 20s and 30s. The Kremlin needs them as both cannon fodder and young families who are supposed to start having more children. But there simply aren't enough of them to do either job. This cohort is about half the size of the generation born in the 1980s. Today, Russia's population is shrinking and aging, with birth rates at their lowest point in decades. In the first half of 2024 alone, only around 600,000 children were born, the lowest figure in 25 years. After that, the government quietly stopped publishing monthly demographic data. By 2025, the numbers had become so grim that demographer Alexei Raksha singled out February 2025, when Rosstat recorded just 90,500 births, the lowest monthly figure since the early 1800s. So when people say Russia can always throw more men at the problem, they're partly living inside an old myth. Yes, the regime keeps finding men. It digs them out of impoverished regions, gutted industrial towns, prisons, ethnic republics, and broken families. It grabs the men with the fewest options and the least leverage. But those men weren't useless surplus. They were also the truck drivers, the welders, the security guards, the warehouse workers, the mechanics, the shift workers. They were the civilian economy. Pull enough of them out, and you hollow out the very infrastructure that keeps the state functioning. Today, Russia is facing an acute labor shortage of at least 2.3 million workers. That gap is spreading across the entire economy, made worse by military recruitment and tighter restrictions on migration. Unemployment has dropped to 2.3%, which only sounds like good news until you understand why. In Russia's case, it means the labor market is so stripped bare that the state is hunting for bodies everywhere it can find them. And Putin isn't stopping. Ukraine has already demonstrated that drones can chew through enormous quantities of infantry. That means the old Russian logic, throw enough bodies at the enemy until you win, is becoming obsolete. But the Kremlin still speaks that old language, because it genuinely doesn't know another one. It still believes that quantity can substitute for competence. But the quantity isn't what it used to be. The macho empire is discovering that its favorite raw material has become scarce. Now let's talk about who fills the gap. When an authoritarian system runs short of men, it turns to women. Not to empower them, to use them, in exactly the way it used men. That is precisely what's happening in Russia right now. For decades, the state maintained a long list of professions deemed too dangerous or too physically demanding for women. Then reality stepped in. In 2021, Russia trimmed that list of banned occupations, allowing women to work as subway operators, train conductors, and truck drivers. The old list had contained hundreds of prohibited jobs inherited from the Soviet era, and it was cut down to around 100. In other words, work the state had long declared too hard or unsuitable for women suddenly became acceptable the moment there weren't enough men available who were willing, sober, alive, nearby, and qualified to do it. This is not a feminist revolution. This is an emergency measure. A woman the system considered biologically unfit yesterday is today good enough to operate heavy machinery, haul freight, and run public transit. Because the alternative is leaving those jobs empty. And that matters, because Russia's official culture remains aggressively gendered. The Kremlin sells a world of real men and real women. Men are fighters, builders, and protectors. Women are mothers, caregivers, and homemakers. But behind that image, the state is quietly moving in the opposite direction, out of sheer necessity. Here's the deeper irony, though. Women were always far more central to Russia than the masculinity myth ever acknowledged. They kept schools running, clinics staffed, offices functioning, local government moving, and family finances from collapsing. Now the state has to lean on them even harder, in domains it once reserved exclusively for men. That is what happens when demography humiliates ideology. And it doesn't stop with working-age women. A healthy society allows older people to slow down. A strained society starts treating them as a reserve labor pool. Russia is aging rapidly, and the war has deepened the workforce deficit. So the state is edging toward a conclusion that is as uncomfortable as it is unavoidable. It cannot afford for people to rest. Here's the scale of what we're talking about. In early 2025, Russia had just over 41 million pensioners, nearly 30% of the entire population, living on state pensions. Russia already raised its retirement age before the full-scale invasion began. That was one of the clearest early signals that the old demographic model was cracking. The post-Soviet labor market was shrinking. Life expectancy had risen just enough to strain the pension system, and the state wanted people working longer. Now imagine what that looks like outside of Moscow. Russia is a country of aging cities, shrinking regions, and falling birth rates. The center still manages to look modern. The periphery gets older every year. Young people leave when they can. Men disappear into the military, the defense sector, or the ground. What's left is a strange landscape. Fewer children in schools, more funerals than births in villages, and jobs held together by people who should have retired years ago. Between 8 and 9 million Russians between the ages of 60 and 70 are still in the workforce. And the majority of them are women. I chose the framing for this section deliberately because the reality is blunt. Grandmothers don't get to retire, not because they're brimming with some kind of joyful Soviet energy, not because work gives them a thrilling sense of purpose, but because the state needs them. The pension is often too small to live on, the family is stretched thin, and sometimes there's simply no one else to hold the front desk at the clinic, the school office, or the municipal service window. You see this pattern across Europe and East Asia too, where aging populations are extending working lives. But the Russian version is harsher, because it's playing out inside a wartime economy that simultaneously drains able-bodied men from the civilian workforce, while demanding more labor in every direction. Now let's talk about the other group the state can't do without, and publicly pretends to despise. Russian nationalism tells one story. The labor market tells a completely different one. The nationalist story goes, Russia belongs to ethnic Russians who fit the cultural script. The economy responds, fine, but who's going to pour the concrete, clean the streets, carry the boxes, and lay the bricks? For years, Russia quietly managed this contradiction. It imported cheap labor from Central Asia. Men from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan came to do the work many Russians didn't want, especially in construction, delivery, housing maintenance, sanitation, logistics, and low-skilled urban jobs. Everyone understood the arrangement, even if no one said it plainly. Empires need outsiders. Then the contradiction sharpened. The war pulled Russian men into the military and the defense sector. Emigration took more workers. At the same time, xenophobic rhetoric intensified, especially after the Crocus City attack in 2024, when hostility towards Central Asian migrants spiked dramatically. Local politicians and regional bosses competed to perform their ethnic credentials. They promised jobs for locals. They played to ethnic anxiety. And then, reality pushed back. Severstal, one of Russia's largest steel producers, warned that a regional ban on migrant construction workers would directly damage major industrial and social infrastructure projects. Within a week, the governor of the Vologda region reversed his migrant labor ban after corporations protested. The official justification for the ban had been concern about jobs for local residents. But when anyone actually looked at the numbers, there simply weren't enough working-age Russians to fill the vacancies. Today, Russia is turning to India for labor, because Central Asian flows are no longer sufficient, and have become politically harder to defend. And here's where the authoritarian logic starts to look genuinely pathetic. A regime that constantly boasts about its strength has to keep importing workers it conditions its population to fear. A state that never stops talking about masculine national renewal cannot keep its labor market running without foreign bodies. And once that gap gets wide enough, the social tension becomes unavoidable. Which brings us to the darkest corner of this picture. When an authoritarian state running short on labor exhausts its conventional options, it gets creative in darker ways. The presence of North Korean labor in Russia is one of the most telling signals of all. In 2025, North Korea sent thousands of military construction workers and sappers into the Kursk region, following North Korean troops who had already been fighting alongside Russian forces there. The fact that Russia is accepting and welcoming this kind of arrangement tells us a great deal. This is the behavior of a state whose labor crisis has become strategic. A state whose political instincts are so distorted that it would rather reach for controlled, coerced, highly dependent foreign labor than rethink the system that created the shortage in the first place. North Korean workers have no bargaining power. They come from one of the most tightly controlled societies on Earth, channeled through a relationship between two regimes that are already trading weapons and soldiers. Once you see the pattern clearly, the logic is hard to miss. The macho empire is short on men. It loads more onto women. It leans on pensioners. It still needs migrants while training its population to resent them. And when even that isn't enough, it reaches for labor that is even more dependent, even more controllable, and even less able to push back. Now let's address the last illusion, and it's the most persistent one. People in the West often imagine that Russia must still have some hidden reserve of brilliant engineers, scientists, and problem solvers. Something like the minds behind Sputnik, waiting in the wings. A deep bench of talent that will eventually step forward, reorganize the economy, close the technology gap, and rescue the system at the last minute. This fantasy doesn't hold up. Russia still has talented individuals. Of course it does. No country of that size fails to produce them. But that is not the same as having a healthy reserve of human capital ready to pull a declining state back from the edge. The longer arc points in the other direction, decades of shrinking research capacity and chronic brain drain. At the end of the Soviet period, Russia had close to 1 million researchers. By 2021, that number had fallen to roughly 340,000, nearly a threefold collapse. And the war is accelerating the process. Isolation from Western institutions has cut Russian researchers off from collaboration, equipment, conferences, and viable career paths. In 2024, CERN terminated cooperation agreements covering around 500 scientists affiliated with Russian institutions. That's one data point among many showing how the country's scientific community is contracting, becoming more insular, and growing less attractive to ambitious young people with options. This is why there is no real reserve waiting in the wings. Because a healthy reserve isn't just raw intelligence. It's the institutions that cultivate talent, reward competence, connect people to global networks, and allow independent initiative to flourish. Putin's system does the opposite. It punishes autonomy, narrows horizons, and teaches the smartest people that the safest career move is emigration, silence, or work that serves the state's immediate needs rather than the country's long-term future. The overall picture that emerges is bleak, but it's also clear. This is a system operating at the edge of its capacity, stretching every available human resource it has left, in every direction, because the math no longer works any other way. Before you go, I want to leave you with a question. In your own country or community, what job or role quietly changed hands because the people who used to fill it stopped being available? Who stepped in? Women? Retirees? Migrants? Foreign workers? Someone else entirely? And what did that shift reveal about the system underneath it? If this video helped you see that pattern more clearly, please hit like and subscribe. Share it with someone who still thinks Russia has an inexhaustible reserve of strength. You can also use hype points to help this episode reach more people. Hit follow so you don't miss the next one.